Good to be here. I'd like these lights off, please. I know the video people will hate me for this, but I'd much rather you see the pictures than see me. They're more pretty anyway. But firstly, I'd like to thank Deutsche Welle for inviting me here. It's a great opportunity to be here with this audience to discuss some of the things that we're talking about. I will start. I'll turn this thing around because I can't actually see the presenter mode here. But there's been a lot of talk about, could we have these lights down, perhaps? Okay, thanks. There's been a lot of talk about the Arab Spring, about the things that have happened. Quite frankly, Arab Spring isn't new. A whole lot of things have been happening all over the globe that we've not always recognized or been aware of, and I'd like to go back and visit that as such. So let's look at it. I mean, if this minute by Farish is dated August 28, 1838, pretty close to the invention of photography. Even lower, if possible, please, yeah? So this sense of natives must either be kept down by a sense of our power, etc., was a dominant theme at that time. Here in Germany, standing in front of you, I'd like to remind you that the natives have for some time become restless. And it's worth remembering. So this is Arab Spring in Bangladesh. 1971, 7th of March, people heading towards a rally. This is not actually the rally itself. People are heading towards a rally. One of the major things, we were effectively under occupation, we were resisting, we were trying to find space for ourselves. And it was very important at that time to document the movements that were happening. Of course, photographers were the people who were doing it. But while all this was happening, I think what is pertinent is the dominance of external powers, originally during British rule that we were trying to resist. Later on here, occupation within our own country where we'd won an election but were not handed over power were things we were resisting. And of course, one of the people who was talking about it was Edward Said. He talked at that time about new media. Now, one of the things I want to assure you is I'm not a pessimist. I'm not someone who's saying technology is bad, it needs to be abandoned. I want to recognize both the powers that it has and the threats that it poses, particularly for people in countries like mine, which I call the majority world countries. And I think it is important to recognize that there are differences and it's not a holistic space. The information age is also the misinformation age. There are a whole lot of things that can be disseminated very effectively. There's a whole lot of propaganda that takes the same route. And people in power, people in control are the people who determine what sort of information goes down. So I think it's pertinent to remember that. But there are some things which is worth looking at. I mean, Nicholas Negroponte, when he talks about the difference between atoms and bits, points out some very pertinent differences. But there are other interesting analogies. I think one of the things that links digital technology with power, with knowledge, with love, well, power, let's leave that one out of it. But knowledge and love are quite interesting in the sense that these are commodities that by sharing do not generally get diminished. And I find that a very interesting difference, which is what gives rise to the many possibilities that we have. So I'm talking about all this. While this is happening in Bangladesh, we were looking to see how we might make a difference, how we might create space for ourselves. As a practitioner, as a photographer, I was very conscious of the fact that if we needed to be relevant, we needed to work in a space where we were closer to the community we dealt with. So obviously, being in London, Paris, or New York, which were the centers of photography, did make sense to us. So we set up shop in Bangladesh. But having done so, we needed to stay relevant. We needed our work to reach out to the public. We needed to link up with, are we moving? Yeah, we are okay. We needed to link up with the photographers, obviously, but we also needed to be in touch with the marketplace. This was a time when we didn't have international telephone lines, we didn't have faxes, we didn't have many of the tools that people take for granted. So one of the things we started doing was to look at ways in which we could circumvent this technological difference. The time was also very interesting. We had, up till that point, there was an autocratic general which was running the country, and we as activists were in the streets trying to bring down this powerful general. The time, end of 1990, beginning of 91, several things happened in 91. There was a cyclone in Bangladesh. Well, firstly, we actually got rid of this general. On the 4th of December 1990, he announced he was stepping down. And in early 1991, we had elections. So that was a major victory. There was also Operation Desert Dust Storm, or whatever it was. They call it the war, but I call it the invasion, occupation of Iraq. That went, there was a cyclone in Bangladesh in 91. And later on, 2 tall buildings fell. So several things happened which were quite significant. But let's start with what was happening in our country. Once the general fell down, we had elections, and that was pretty significant. Khaleda Zia, who later became Prime Minister, this is a beautiful, open situation where the people are obviously jubilant, there's hope, there's light, there's optimism. But we discovered that having a fair and free election doesn't in itself lead to democracy. There are other issues involved. And this is Khaleda Zia after she got elected. Now, this difference, sadly, doesn't apply only to one regime. I think the face of leaders before and after election is something that we've all been pretty familiar with, and this is something that we had to contend with over a period of time. So, while this was happening, one of the first tests that this government had to face was this major cyclone that took place at the end of April. And the people who came to save us were the people from the angels from Desert Storm. Having done what they did in Iraq, they then came as angels to save Bangladesh from the pain that they had. The interesting thing is, while we were vaguely familiar with what was happening in Iraq at that time, the fact that a lot had been happening prior to that is something that was not in major circulation. Now, the reason I point out that time is because that is the sort of time when email started evolving. We weren't really using internet in that same way. Things were beginning to happen. Even in countries like mine, we were exploring options. And I think it's significant to look at what Pilger says at that time. There are signs that Washington is about to extend its current war to Iraq. Yet unknown to most of us, almost every day, RAF and American aircraft already bomb Iraq. This was happening. This was happening over a long period of time. It was never mentioned. Mainstream media was not interested. It didn't fit. There was complete control of international media, and this did not come into our reckoning. This could not have happened today. I think they would not have gotten away with this today. But there were other things that happened in terms of reporting. This image is quite interesting. I say we're the goodness of pain for a very specific reason. I remember Madeleine Albright talking about how the death of 500,000 children in Iraq was a price worth paying. The death of 500,000 American children would definitely not have been considered a price worth paying. So it is a question of what is considered human, the value of certain lives being different from other lives, and I think it's significant to recognize those shifts. So at that time, what was the role that the media was playing? Now, this embedded journalism was not initially done here. It was actually the invasion of Grenada where they perfected it. But during this invasion of Iraq, certainly embedded journalism became something that came into public reckoning. Photographers could only go in through them with the military, and if pictures were to be sent out, they had to be sent out through the military pool. Kenneth Jereke, a contact press images photographer who took this image, sent out these images through the military pool, but it slipped. The military pool hadn't actually censored this. They let it through. But there was another layer of defense. The media itself decided that these pictures were not the right pictures. It didn't fit. It didn't go along with this story of the time, which is that it was a clean, clinical invasion with zero collateral damage. A charred Iraqi soldier rocked the boat. The story was killed, and it was actually in London. When it first came out, the editor was vilified. It came out in American Photography. Eventually, it did leak out. But the point was, there was no censorship, certainly not from the military. The media itself decided it had to obey certain rules. Now, this is the time when we decide we need to do something else. And I will try this. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. I'm going to try and show you something or give you a sound which some of you will recognize, I think. Let's try this. Whoops, no, that's not right. That isn't working. Sorry about this. Let's see if this works. Do you recognize the sound, some of you? It'll be very nostalgic. I can see some of you smiling. Now, the quotation from our Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, was actually at a later time, but I'm putting it in now because it's still relevant. While all this is happening, actually only a very small percentage of Bangladeshis have access to electricity. So we're talking about all these things when this has to be remembered. Let's move on. At that time, the two cows prop up a projector has an interesting analogy, because at that time I'd done a little bit of homework and I worked out that the 1200 baud modems that we were using cost approximately the same as a cow. And I was beginning to toy with this idea of what happens when a modem costs more than a cow. This was taken in Mongolia, where there was a particular show, and I could see that the modems were used for different purposes. Yeah? Obviously, we've improvised and things like that. The modems were losing relevance. At this stage, they still aren't good enough to deliver milk. But, you know, modems do have their limitations. But we started using modems. We started using offline FidoNet technology. We were using what will now be considered very primitive, but at that time, this offline FidoNet technology gave us a bridge to the rest of the world, which was very powerful, very necessary. And because of it, we were able to do a huge number of things which prior to that would have been considered unimaginable. But let's look at the cost implications. At that time, to transmit 1 kilobyte of data cost us 30 US cents. So a 1 megabyte file would have cost $300 to transmit. Even that, for us, was an opportunity, and we grabbed it. So we set up this email network, and the next pictures are quite interesting. On the left are my mum and dad. Sadly, they've passed away. My dad teaching my mum to use the computer. On the right is that young man, Ghulam Qasim, the first Bengali Muslim short story writer. We've published his first photograph at the tender age of 98. When he was 101, he used email for the first time. Very interesting guy. And we have his archives dating back to 1918 and things like that. But anyway, I won't digress on that. What we'd done was we set up an electronic postbox. The emails would come into our server. It would go into this electronic postbox. We didn't have an international telephone line, so Amsterdam would ring us twice a day. The electronic postbox would go to Amsterdam, from there go on to the server, from there go on to the internet. The reverse process would take place. It would all come back to all the people in various places of Bangladesh. We even had a fax gateway. So someone from a village in Bangladesh with an ordinary analog telephone line could transmit a fax through this process. It was phenomenal. And there are some interesting things, but I won't dwell on that because we'll try and do it in question time. So the server we were using was an old 286 machine. We only had one telephone line, so a friend of ours called Mohandas from Bangalore made us a fax data modem switch so we could use the one telephone line for all three functions. With that, we were the hub of Bangladesh's email network. And the people we were serving were the World Bank, embassies, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, big NGOs like BRAC and Grameen, and all we had was this 1286 machine. All of them had very different resources. But what we did with this, I found interesting. This was Taslima Nasreen, the feminist writer, who was being persecuted at that time, and it was our email network that allowed us to access, stay in touch with PEN, Article 19, and eventually allowed safe access to Taslima outside of Bangladesh. But the other players were by then very active in alleviating poverty. Poverty, of course, is an issue that has to be addressed. There were all these poor people, they had to be saved. And the way in which many of them did that was by building monuments to poverty. So let's look at the monuments to poverty. This is the rooftop terrace of one of the big NGOs, the one tall building in Mirpur at that time. And from this terrace, looking across, you would see another tall building far away. That is the Grameen Bank Tower, another monument to poverty. Right now, of course, there are many other tall buildings. At that time, that was the only one there. From there, further down the road in Mahakali, this is the lobby of BRAC, their new center. Again, one of the largest NGOs in the world, providing, saving millions across the globe. And not to be outdone, the UNICEF office and all of these organizations were being provided email by that 1286 server in our office. They were scattered around a place called Dhanmondi, where we are, and consolidated to move to the Sheraton. Now, you have to really suffer to save the poor. And my heart goes out to these people who worked so hard to save the poor, while all we were doing was providing connectivity to them. So we thought we'd provide connectivity in a different way. We went to the people that they had decided they were not going to give technology to, and we went to a small village just outside of Sylhet to provide connectivity to a place called Durga Pasha, a village. And these are conservative areas, girls going to schools in places which were ostensibly considered not too progressive. And we'd worked out what we had to do to make them accept the fact that this technology could be useful. So we came up with what we thought was a great idea. We looked at environment, we looked at poverty alleviation, tried to marry the two, and we came up with this idea that if a donor spent $15 to support this, to sponsor a tree, we would have $10 from that 15 go to the school for its technology. The $5 would actually go to planting the tree. We would split it up between the landowner and the worker. They would grow crops. They would generate revenue from it. It was a lovely idea where we grew trees, and the process of growing trees supported this. And the trees would grow up to be big things, and we would sell the trees, give the money back to the original sponsor. So the sponsor who spent $15 would get back something like $150 after 20 years. And we would even factor in insurance. So if the tree died, they would get paid for it. So it was a lovely idea, yeah, beautifully thought of, all things considered. It didn't work. As many great ideas, it was a complete flop because the people weren't interested in trees. All these nature-loving agrarian communities that we looked at wanted computers. And we had a flood shortly after that. And even during the floods, we had to deliver computers because that's what they wanted. And we had a lot of learning to do through this process. But we also had some practical problems and some practical solutions, which I'll share with you. This one is a tower that we built. Why did we build this tower? Because by then, we'd actually gone onto internet itself. We had a VSAT on our rooftop, very expensive technology. But the satellite we linked with, Intelsat 2, which was directly overhead, was very expensive. There was a cheaper satellite lower down across the horizon called Agila. And, but there was a tree in the way. So we couldn't access this cheap satellite. So we built a 100-foot tower, put our VSAT on top of it to peer over the tree to get the cheaper satellite. So, you know, we improvised, and I think it's interesting to see how these things happen. But the point I'm making is that there is, while all this is happening, we had to recognize that there was a cultural and a technological dominance we needed to deal with. And I'm not for once suggesting that I be pessimistic, that I say there are problems with this. There are problems, but I think we need to take it on board. I think we use our ingenuity, our flexibility, our ability to slip through the cracks to turn this thing around. And I think that remains the important challenge. Now, I'm going to try and show you something here which hopefully will work. This is the festival of photography that we do every 2 years. And we do it in very difficult circumstances. I'm showing you this because I think it's important to recognize that the spaces within which we work and how we make it work. Because for us, it's very important that we engage and use all the tools at our disposal. Culture, technology. One of the things that's happening here is an outdoor mobile exhibition that we do regularly. We do the high-profile exhibitions, but can we have the volume on that? Is there a volume?
It's also evidence of its resilience that we were able to pull off a major international festival at a time when most things in Bangladesh were being switched off. The tap was being switched off. To get people like Noam Chomsky, we had Mahishata Devi, immense stature from this country.
Live streaming, we got Noam Chomsky from MIT talking to Mahishata Devi with the local audience in Bangladesh. So all sorts of things are happening simultaneously. This had never happened before. I mean, we haven't been able to pull together such a fantastic group of people under one space.
It's a festival.
Because of email, we were able to get in touch with the Nelson Mandela Foundation, get access to a whole lot of things that were happening. But at the same time, we stayed very relevant, very close to the public, engaging with that audience, and we had fun. We took to the streets. And I think it's worthwhile remembering that technology in itself is not the answer. It's how you use technology, how you merge it, and the power of technology and culture together, I think, provides a very, very strong mix, which is difficult to put down. And of course, I constantly come across the situation. Here I am, a bearded Muslim in front of you. So often the question you do not ask is how many wives I have, how much I beat them up, and all the other things. But there is a different Bangladesh that I'd like to remind you of. Right now, one of the things which are very important for us is the trial of the war criminals that we're trying to do. And bringing in Ocampo was also part of that, the fact that we wanted to give legitimacy to what we were doing. Now we come to something else. And I did tell you earlier that what we were talking about in terms of the act of governments before and after election is not new. And even with the new government, I can see my friend, the ambassador, sitting here. He might not like this, but this is something I also need to tell you about. The Sufyan's work related to crossfire and other things that were happening, it is something that has been happening in Bangladesh for a long, long time. Extrajudicial killings cannot be tolerated, will not be tolerated, but are continuing. What we did was we put together a major exhibition looking at extrajudicial killings, and this was a Google Earth map, which we put up, which was backed up by extensive research, where every pin relates to a particular killing somewhere in Bangladesh. And it was available online. The idea was ordinary people could come on and provide information which would add to it. That too didn't work, because the ordinary Bangladeshi doesn't feel confident enough to come online when they can be tracked, when their IP addresses can be mapped, and when Facebook and YouTube have already been stopped in Bangladesh and people have been arrested, they find themselves vulnerable. What we did was we were strategic. We utilized the fact that there is international media. We had a media embargo staggered across the continents. So on the 17th of March, New York Times ran it as a front page event. It slowly came across. But on the day, there was the government closed down our entire gallery, the offices itself. It was surrounded by riot police. While that was happening, I went inside We were meant to do a Skype interview with the Secretary General of Reporters Sans Frontières, Alain Julien. And this is what I'm doing. I'm actually doing a Skype gallery walk with Reporters Sans Frontières inside the gallery, being live streamed. The whole world is watching, interacting, while there's riot police surrounding my gallery, stopping people from coming in. So I think it's interesting how these mechanisms can be used to work. And right now the show is in New York at the Queen's Museum of Art. But while the riot police was around, we did two things. Can we have a little bit of volume, please? So it's interesting, this man has made a death threat against me. He doesn't realize I'm filming him. I'm doing an interview of him, and he is in front of the riot police making threats to me, and the police are reaffirming what is happening, and we've of course got it on record. So this gets added on to the body of work that we've done. And so we take on board everything that is happening at one stage and turn it around to our advantage. In this particular case, we took the government to court. They were forced to back down. We had the show open for 1 day. I don't have a lot of time to dwell on that. I'm just going to end with a couple of pictures. One, looking at what we're now attempting to do. We've set up an entity called Majority World, and that has a history in itself. We were called Third World, Developing World, Least Developed Countries. I don't want to be third anything. And I see no reason why countries like these should be called First World and we should be called Third World. And we wanted to remind this First World countries that the G8 countries constitute 13% of the world's population. And when they sit down in their meetings and make decisions which affect the farmer in my country, I want to remind them that the words that they use, democracy and freedom, doesn't represent us. We never chose them to be our representatives. And when they make decisions that affect our lives, there is a serious issue at stake. So we set up, initially, we tried to address the terminology. Instead of calling ourselves Third World, we called ourselves Majority World. And that's a term that's become far more familiar. And we set up, I did something smart. I bought the domain, majorityworld.com, many years ago. What we also did was to set up an online portal which represents the work of Latin American, African, Asian photographers of the majority world. So we began to utilize this technology to create a space where our work would be seen, would be disseminated, where we could tell our stories. There is a very interesting African phrase. It goes something like, until the lions can tell their own stories, stories about hunting will always glorify the hunter. And I think that is something that we want to remind people of. Till this point, to a large extent, it's white Western photographers who come to my country, who have told my story, who have represented me to the wider world. I think we want to turn it around. And this technology offers us now, finally, a chance to do that. And I will end with a photograph taken last week. Those of you who might be transmitting it, could we have the lights down for this one at least? Because this is a nice picture, and it's much prettier to see that than to see me. But this young man, his name is Russell John, and he does something very interesting. He and his friends use their computer power to link up with computers all across the globe to pool their computing resources together and look for foreign aliens. And I find that fascinating. I see no reason why Bangladeshis should not be engaged in things like that and only be relegated to certain types of tasks. And I asked this guy, why are you doing this? And he had a very interesting answer. He says, you know, if I discover an alien, it will be named after me. And I see no problem why some star, some planet in some galaxy out there should not be named after a Bangladeshi called Russell John. I'll leave you on that. Thank you.